Good day. My last video is about the Pentagon's confirmation that in August, China tested a hypersonic glide vehicle which orbited the Earth and missed its target by only a small distance. And US commentators were reported as having said that China had made astounding progress in this technology, and the United States and the Pentagon were left astonished at the speed with which the Chinese are progressing in developing these types of weapons. Well, I said an announcement, I said this, that this information had come up from the United States. Actually, there's been no formal announcement at all. What we got was a clearly very well-sourced article which appeared in the Financial Times and which is clearly being read around the world. But there is no doubt at all that the information in the Financial Times, that article about this hypersonic test, was true. Now we have had the Chinese response, and just as the Pentagon's announcement was a non-announcement done through the media based on quotes of anonymous officials, so the Chinese confirmation is a non-confirmation, taking the form of an editorial in Global Times. There's been no formal confirmation from the Chinese government about whether the hypersonic glide vehicle test actually took place. The Chinese government, as it always does on all matters relating to China's strategic deterrent, neither confirmed nor denied that such a test in fact took place. But the Global Times editorial is an extremely interesting one, and it, in effect, in my opinion, implicitly confirms the information from the United States, about the truth of which I have no doubt, and it provides some indication as to Chinese thinking and as to the Chinese reasoning behind their development of their strategic nuclear deterrent, and also their thinking behind their development of these hypersonic glide vehicles. Now, I'm going to read this editorial in full. It's fairly long, not as long as some of the pieces that Global Times has written, but I think it's perhaps useful to do that in order to get a sense, an overall sense of what Chinese thinking is in terms of its nuclear weapons development programs. And here's what the article says. US should stop eyeing too much on China's hypersonic missiles and broaden its horizons. Now, this, I have to say, is an extraordinarily enigmatic title. It's not entirely clear what it's supposed to mean. But anyway, let's go on and read the article itself. The Financial Times quoted on Saturday several sources saying that the Chinese military launched a rocket that carried a hypersonic glide vehicle in August and judged it to be a nuclear-capable hypersonic missile. According to the FT article, the missile flew through low Earth orbit space and could help China negate US missile defense systems, which are designed to target the fixed parabolic trajectory of a ballistic missile. The progress of the Chinese military has caught US intelligence by surprise, the report said. The US generally has the ability to monitor global missile launches. If the FT report is to be believed, it means that there is a key new member in China's nuclear deterrence system, which is a new blow to the US's mentality of strategic superiority over China. It's a very elegant way of telling us that this test actually happened. The United States has all the means to keep track on launches, so if it tells us that China launched such a vehicle, well, that must be so. Anyway, to continue. According to the FT, the China Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology announced the 77th and 79th launches of the Long March 2C rocket, but there was no announcement of a 78th launch. The report believes the 78th secret launch may be to test the above-mentioned hypersonic missile. Well, that's almost certainly true. The FT also reported that China has tested a new space capability with a hypersonic missile, citing sources. It said the missile missed its target by about 30 kilometers, yet the test showed that China had made astounding progress on hypersonic weapons. But if Chinese authorities do not voluntarily release such top defense secrets, others can only speculate based on technical monitoring methods. Now that's, again, a rather gentle way of saying, well, maybe this system, this hypersonic glide vehicle missed its target, or maybe it didn't. It's for the United States is to speculate about these things. We're not going to confirm one way or the other how successful or not successful this test actually was. The Chinese are having their little joke, and, well, let's allow them that. It is meaningless to discuss the credibility of the FT report, but it is important to note the unstoppable trend that China is narrowing the gap with the US in some key military technologies as China is continuously developing its economic and technological strength. China doesn't need to engage in an arms race with the US. It is capable of weakening the US's overall advantages over China by developing military power at its own pace. In the long term, the comparison between the military powers of China and the United States will be in the following paradigm. The US's overall military advantage will be maintained, whilst its Air Force and Navy have higher quality and its global deployment and projection capabilities will be unmatched by China's. That's an immensely important sentence. I will come to it shortly. Meanwhile, China won't have any will to globally challenge the United States' dominant position in military sphere, and the US shouldn't worry about losing its military hegemony. However, China's military build-up will focus on the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea. It is inevitable that China will take an upper hand over the United States military strength in these areas, thanks to the geographical proximity and the continuous increase of China's output. Chinese society has not only strong expectations for this, but also strong determination and corresponding ability to realize this reversal. The US's conventional military superiority around the world will not translate into a guarantee of superiority in these regions. The US is very concerned about China's nuclear development. There is no doubt that China has no plans to build a nuclear force of the same size as that of the US. In other words, we have no intention of launching a nuclear arms race with the United States. However, China will certainly improve the quality of its nuclear deterrence to ensure that the US completely eliminates the idea of nuclear blackmail against China at any critical moment, and its idea of using nuclear forces to make up for the weakness that US's conventional forces cannot crush China. Greater survivability and penetration ability of Chinese nuclear missiles is clearly being accelerated through a variety of new missiles. That, by the way, is an implicit admission that this test has indeed taken place. They're confirming that there's been greater survivability and penetration ability of Chinese nuclear missiles, and that this is being accelerated, and that new missiles, including by implication hypersonic glide vehicles, are appearing. Such development will ensure that neither country's nuclear forces will be used as a tool to solve regional problems. This would ensure that the damage to peace, if any, would be limited, and that that region would not see a deadly collision between major powers. The US is constantly releasing rumours that China is strengthening its nuclear strategic tools, which is believed to pave the way for public opinion in the United States to further increase its military expenditure from a high starting point. Perhaps we need to point out that no matter how much military spending the US increases and how much new equipment it procures, it is impossible for the United States to continue to enjoy overwhelming military superiority in China's coastal areas. Washington needs to be realistic and rethink its approach to China. The future strategic balance between China and the United States cannot be achieved by carrying out an extreme arms race. The two sides need to rebuild a certain strategic mutual trust, which is the key to forming a security buffer zone between China and the United States. Can't major powers with different political systems cooperate with each other to achieve a win-win result? Must one overwhelm the other? As China and the US prepare for the worst, we must not give up. Both sides must explore a political and security framework that can accommodate the major long-term interests of both countries for the benefit of both countries and the world at large, and never yield in that. Now, that is an extremely interesting editorial, and of course it explains exactly what the Chinese are up to. And I come back to that that key sentence in the article. The US's overall military advantage will be maintained while its Air Force and Navy have higher quality, and its global deployment and projection capabilities will be unmatched by China's. Meanwhile, China won't have any will to globally challenge the US's dominant position in the military sphere, and the US shouldn't worry about losing its military hegemony. However, China's military buildup will focus on the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea. It is inevitable that China will take an upper hand over the United States military strength in these areas, thanks to geographical proximity and the continuous increase of China's output. And what the Chinese are saying to the United States is this: yes, we are enhancing our strategic nuclear defense capability. Yes, we are testing hypersonic glide vehicles. We're not admitting that. We're teasing you a little about this, but that is in fact and in practice what we are doing. However, contrary to all the flesh-creeping talk that is spreading around the United States, we are not there to try to obtain military superiority globally over you. We have no aspiration to be a military hegemon in replacement or substitution to yourself. We are happy to work with you to agree a stable international environment, one which preserves stability around the world. But we will achieve military superiority around the seas that border our country. And we have overriding concerns about Taiwan and about the South China Sea, and we will develop and build up our conventional military forces to the point where, even if you are superior across the rest of the world, you cannot challenge us in these areas which are directly important and which concern and affect ourselves. And that includes Taiwan, and it includes the South China Sea. And at the same time that we're going to do that, and that we're going to build up this capability, we are also going to develop our strategic nuclear capability. And that is what this hypersonic glide vehicle is all about. We are not, again, out to overtake you in some kind of nuclear arms race. We are developing a nuclear weapons capability sufficient to ensure that if there is a clash in the South China Sea or in the Taiwan Straits, if we have to take military action because Taiwan is making moves towards secession, then we will be able to take conventional steps to bring Taiwan under our control and to ensure our control over the South China Sea. And you will not, in that case, be able to threaten us with nuclear weapons because our nuclear weapons capability will be sufficient for us to be able to deal out unacceptable damage against you. So, given that this is what we're about, we're not out to replace you as the world's great hegemon and become or establish ourselves as the world's hegemonic hyperpower in substitution to you. Given that this is our objective, why don't you come to terms? Why don't you accept that we have superiority and core interests in Taiwan and in the South and East China Seas, and recognize that fact and agree that position with us and accept that sooner or later we are going to unite Taiwan with our country, with China, which is one and indivisible. We're going to achieve that. Why don't you accept that? You can't prevent it. You can't resist it. It will be a disaster for you if you were to try, and come to terms with us. And if you want to have your bases around the world and you want to have your great navy which steams around the world and you want to do all sorts of things in all sorts of places, well, that's your business. We don't agree with that. We don't think much of what you're doing. We think it's misguided. We think it's wrong. But we are not going to interfere in it because it is not part of our core interests. And that's what the Chinese are trying to tell the United States. They're saying to the United States, look, we are not the aggressor. We are not out to try to revise the world system. We're not out to topple you from your position of leadership. The entire problem is that you do not recognize or acknowledge that we have our own core interests that we will not retreat from and which we will resolutely defend. Interests that we will resolutely defend in the Taiwan Straits, on the island of Taiwan, and in the South and East China Seas. It is you who is creating the international tension. It is not us. And if you're prepared to do a deal with us in which you recognize our core interests and, if you like, our sphere of interests around our particular sea borders, then, as I said, we're absolutely happy to come to terms with you, and strategic stability between us and you can be restored. And by the way, the same is being said about the Russians. The Russians have also said, and I'm going to discuss that in a separate video, but I've discussed it in other places many times, that the Russians too have core interests. They want to see no further expansion of NATO into the territories of the former Soviet Union. They absolutely do not want to see Ukraine part of NATO. They made it very clear that that is a red line for them. Dmitry Peskov, the Russian presidential spokesman, has just confirmed as much in an interview with French television. And again, if the United States acknowledges and accepts this and stops all its various campaigns of trying to extend NATO and its soft underbelly, the European Union, into the former Soviet space, and if it stops also its constant regime change efforts in Moscow, again, There is no reason, there is no fundamental reason why Russia and the United States cannot come to terms. Both the Chinese and the Russians are offering the United States that geostrategic ceasefire that I've talked about in so many videos. This editorial in Global Times says it explicitly. But the Chinese are also saying something else. They're saying if you don't accept that, if you, the United States, continues to challenge us in these places close to our maritime borders, if you continue to meddle in Taiwan, if you continue to interfere in the South China Sea, if you won't acknowledge that we have a zone of interest around our own borders, then you do have an arms race on your hands. And at that point, you will lose, because our industrial and manufacturing capability ultimately is greater than yours. Whilst we are not seeking to topple you, that is what will happen if you don't acknowledge that we have core interests and that you should accept them. Now, we've had a Russian article which is clearly written before the Chinese nuclear hypersonic glide vehicle test, but which clearly, in its own way, touches on this question and gives some idea of what's going on. And by the way, I should say that this article clearly shows, as far as I'm concerned, that the Russians were informed about this test, this hypersonic glide vehicle test, in advance. And they went out of their way to contact the United States, to the US officials about this. The article, which appears in the Russian newspaper Nezavisimaya Gazeta, quotes Jeffrey Eberhardt, who is the US Special Presidential Representative for Nuclear Proliferation. And in it, he talks about the fact that the United States wants China to acknowledge that it is a powerful nuclear nation and should join the strategic stability talks which are being led by Russia and the United States. And Nezavisimaya Gazeta goes on to say that Beijing has said time and time again that it will join the conversation if the United States reduces its nuclear deterrent to China's level. And this is at a time when images from American satellites indicate that China is building hundreds of silos to launch nuclear missiles. And the point that's being made here is that the Chinese will not tie themselves down. They will not negotiate with the United States on strategic arms limitations, except on an equal basis. Given that the Russians are making exactly the same demand, they're saying that they too will only negotiate with the United States strategic arms caps on an equal basis. That means that the United States, if it were to continue to insist that China become involved in these talks, it would have to accept that China and Russia together have twice as many nuclear weapons as the United States does. Well, I need hardly say that that's never going to happen. The United States will never agree to such a thing. So, given that this is so, it is better for the United States to do what the Chinese are saying. Basically, agree your strategic arms limitations with the Russians. Do so on an equal basis. We're not interested, China is not interested in overtaking or matching the United States in terms of its overall nuclear capabilities, or indeed its naval capabilities or its air force capabilities. But in that case, if that's what you want to do, and you want to preserve your position as the country which has the most nuclear weapons in the world alongside Russia, then again, you must come to terms with us on those issues which are of strategic importance to us: the South and East China Seas and Taiwan. Now, that, I suspect, is something that the United States finds extremely difficult to do. But as I discussed in my most recent program, the United States has a choice, because I don't think the Chinese are going to shift from that position, and I don't think the Russians are going to shift from their position that they will only agree to strategic arms limitations with the Americans from a position of equality. Either the United States negotiates this geostrategic ceasefire with China, and by the way, also with Russia, or it is in an arms race, in effect, with both countries. Because if the Chinese nuclear deterrent increases in size to the point where it becomes worrying for the United States, and we've seen with this development of that hypersonic glide vehicle that we are actually rapidly approaching that position, if the United States wants to achieve that level of superiority over China, that preserve that level of superiority that it has at the moment, then what it will have to do is it will have to break strategic arms limitation talks with the Russians. It will have to scrap them because, as I said, the Russians insist on equality. And at that point, the United States will be in an arms race with China, with its greater industrial base, and also with Russia as well. And Russia has shown that it is fully capable of developing strategic arms almost at the same pace and at the same level as the United States is. Now, that is the makings of a geopolitical disaster. It is something that I would have thought the United States absolutely should want to avoid at almost any cost, and should try to find some way of avoiding and getting out of. And in fact, we are beginning to see some people in the United States who are gradually edging towards understanding that some kind of geopolitical ceasefire is actually essential. There's been a very interesting article in the National Interest, this strange magazine, which, as I said, pretends sometimes to take a realist position on foreign policy, but which in practice often does so. And it accepts that to counter Russia and China, the United States might have to return to the concept of spheres of influence. And I'm going to read parts of this article briefly, and they read as follows. There is an increasing threat of a two-front war with Russia and China, stemming from their increasing superiority over the United States in terms of nuclear, electromagnetic, pulse, and cyber weapons. Despite this increasing US strategic military inferiority, many, if not most, US policy makers continue to believe that the United States is the strongest military power on Earth. This fallacy has caused them to neglect rebuilding America's nuclear arsenal, building a comprehensive national missile defense system, and hardening the US electric grid to deter a catastrophic attack by Russia or China. US leaders must discard their idealistic misconception of a safe and secure unipolar world in which the United States is universally recognized as the most powerful superpower. The reality is entirely different. America now faces increasingly stark, limited, and uncomfortable choices, and is in desperate need of a new forward-thinking grand strategy that counters, divides, and disrupts this burgeoning alliance between the two nuclear superpowers, Russia and China. To answer this unprecedented national security dilemma and ensure America's survival, US leaders must replace their pursuit of hegemony, an outdated and failed grand strategy, with one of strategic retrenchment and offshore balancing. A strategy of strategic retrenchment would conserve America's precious blood and treasure, along with its limited military resources, and refocus them on the defense of core, vital US interests. It would reduce the risks of the outbreak of an unnecessary war with America's nuclear superpower adversaries, leading to a safer, more secure, and hopefully more peaceful world. Retrenchment would seek to ensure that no one major power dominates Europe and Northeast Asia. However, it would force US allies to assume the main security burden in their respective regions and would rely on local powers to balance regional hegemons such as Russia and China. US military forces would remain stationed over the horizon, either offshore or within the United States, eschewing the forward deployed posture where US forces essentially serve as tripwires that ensure US entanglement in foreign wars in the event of aggression, but are insufficient to defend US allies or even to deter such aggression in the first place. A strategy of offshore balancing would restore US freedom of action to choose which wars to be involved in and which ones to avoid, given that such wars could quickly and unexpectedly escalate to the nuclear level. And then he goes on to, this article goes on to discuss the form that this would take, and it would talk about a scaled-back US military presence would involve a complete US withdrawal of military forces from Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. There might be some limited numbers of US troops left in Germany and possibly Japan, and the United States would thereby be able to fall back on its core strategy of trying to develop its own regional sphere of influence. And then it would talk about dividing the world into spheres of influence, and the article proposes that the United States would retain the largest sphere of influence, including the entire Western Hemisphere, Latin America in other words, Western Europe, Japan, Australia and New Zealand, which would remain protected by the US nuclear umbrella. Notice, by the way, that South Korea is not included in this grouping. The Russian sphere of influence would include the former Soviet republics, Serbia, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Libya. Well, we'll say a little more about that. And China's sphere of influence might consist of North Korea, Taiwan, the South China Sea, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the four Marxist communist nations in Southeast Asia, and around half a dozen African nations currently led by Marxist communist dictators. Well, I mean, there is a lot in this article which is straightforwardly absurd. But anyway, it's an apparent acknowledgement, despite the sarcastic and indeed insulting language directed at the Russians and the Chinese, that the United States simply cannot compete with both Russia and China at the same time. It now finds itself in a position of geostrategic inferiority, and it is losing, or in danger of losing, the arms race. And it talks about a retreat into spheres of influence, and it casually tosses countries like Iran, Iraq, Syria and Libya into Russia's hands and African countries into China's hands. Absurd ideas. I mean, the Russians have no interest in a sphere of influence that extends all the way to Libya, for example, and Iran certainly would not want to consider itself part of any country's sphere of influence. But anyway, it appears to recognize that there would be a sphere of influence, or as I think the Russians and the Chinese would prefer to say, zones of interest, vital interests, where the United States would fall back on its core territories and core regions and the regions it has to defend in order to preserve its security and position, and would recognize that the Chinese and the Russians insist and require the same. Well, is that going to be agreed? Will we ever see proposals of that kind take form or take shape? Well, I have to say it's good to see that articles like that are appearing. I'm not convinced that they represent the consensus view in the United States at the moment. But having said that, the author of that article in National Interest is a gentleman called David T. Pine, who we learn is a former US Army Combat Arms and HQ staff officer. He has an MA in National Security Studies from Georgetown University. Georgetown University, by the way, along with John Hopkins, is one of the major sort of training centers for people who are interested in the United States, who involve themselves in foreign security and international relations policy. And we learn that he currently serves as Deputy Director of National Operations for the EMP Caucus on National and Homeland Security. So he's clearly, to some extent, a specialist, a technology specialist. Now, as I said, he has expressed these views. Others in the United States undoubtedly have different views. I suspect that there is, at the moment, a discussion going on about all of this within the United States, within the think tank community, within places like the Brookings Institution and the Rand Corporation. These are the two premier US government think tanks, and probably within the Pentagon. The opposition to any such move towards retrenchment and towards any such move towards granting or agreeing what the Americans like to call spheres of influence, but as I said, what the Russians prefer and the Chinese prefer to see as zones of interest to the globe, to the great powers, is simply enormous. And I would say anyway, as I said, that the Russians and the Chinese are not interested in these great global empires that this gentleman, Mr. Pine, seems minded to grant to them. What the Russians and the Chinese want is acknowledgement by the United States that they have red lines and core interests which they will defend. If the United States is prepared to do that, then we can start to move towards a more stable international position. And, as I said, Mr. Pine's article, for all its many absurdities, is perhaps a step in that direction. I have to say, though, that at the moment, I think it is inconceivable that ideas like this would gain much traction in the core of the US government, in the White House, the State Department, the National Security Council, not to mention Congress. I think in all of these places, the neocon idea that the United States can go on pushing relentlessly and looking for ways to expand its influence, and that it's somehow working out some great mission to reshape the world in a way that suits the United States and its particular ideology. I think these views are still very much the prevailing or ascendant ones. I don't think that we're going to see any fundamental change of US policy reflecting these vaguely realist positions that Mr. Pine and the National Interest seem to be talking about. But it is interesting, as I said, that there are people in the United States who are gradually coming round to these views. All I will say, and I will say this again, is that the longer the United States waits before it finally does what I suspect is inevitable if war is to be avoided, which is come to some kind of terms with the Chinese and the Russians along the lines of this geostrategic ceasefire that these two countries are each in their respective ways offering, the longer the United States waits before it does that, the steeper the price the United States will have to pay when it does eventually, very reluctantly, and I suspect with very great difficulty, come to terms. And I would finish this article. I'm going to finish this article by coming to an entirely different article, which is not at all about China and the United States. It is about Russia and the United States, and it points again to the strategic dilemma. This article is by a gentleman called Mr. Daniel Gur. And Mr. Gur, writing in a magazine which is called Breaking Defense. The United States has an almost infinite number of these think tank-based websites and magazines. He writes as follows: with all eyes on China, US Army must ensure it's prepared to deter Russia in Europe. And then he goes on to say it's become almost an article of faith in the Department of Defense that China is rapidly becoming the threat of greatest concern to the United States. The combination of China's economic power, investments in advanced technology, large-scale military build-up, and ability to operate in the so-called grey zone of conflict raised concerns in the Pentagon regarding the ability of the US and allied forces in the region to deter Chinese aggression, both in near and far terms. Some defense officials had even offered the opinion that the balance of military power in the Western Pacific has already shifted to such a degree that the United States could lose to China in a future conflict over Taiwan. But such a myopia for the Pacific too often overlooks, to America's peril, Russia and its growing land forces. It can be argued that the threat posed by the former Cold War foe is both more immediate and more stressing than that of China, and should be a higher priority to the US's land fighting forces in the army. A number of studies and war games support the case that Russia could conduct a rapid round invasion of the Baltic states whilst employing its anti-access area denial assets to disrupt NATO's responses. Russia has demonstrated an ability to rapidly concentrate significant ground combat forces on its western borders. Moscow recently announced that it was creating new land combat forces in its western military district, which abuts NATO's eastern border. As the Army's modernization focuses on forces and weapon systems with the Pacific theatre in mind, it cannot forget to ensure that forces in Europe are of sufficient quantity and quality to deter any Russian designs on the continent. So here we see, again, that the problems that the United States has. If you continue to have bad relations with China and Russia at one and the same time, then obviously you're going to have to try and keep up with the Chinese in the Pacific, but you're going to have to keep up with the Russians in Europe also, and in the North Atlantic. And the Russians are busy developing their land forces. They've shown enormous capabilities there. They could defeat us in the Baltic states, just as the Chinese could defeat us in Taiwan. And we've got to do something about that, otherwise we will be outmatched by them. And if we start focusing too much on China, then we will take the eye off the ball and the Russians will win in the Baltic states. And you can be absolutely certain that there are US officials, US military officials, who are making the actually exact opposite argument. They're saying, we're in danger of losing Taiwan. Our position in the Pacific is about to collapse. We've got to focus all our energies on China. We can't afford to devote too much time on Russia because the main danger is in China. So this highlights the extraordinary problems that the US now has. And it's interesting to see that this gentleman who's written this article, Mr. Daniel Gur, he doesn't actually show any recognition that the United States has to balance priorities and has only finite resources. He says, well, we have all these problems in the Pacific with China. They're very serious. So we've got to do something about that. We've got to do all the things that people talk about. We've got to develop and build up our military forces in the Pacific, but we've got to build up our military forces in Europe also. And we are already spending more than most countries spend on defense. Our defense budget is already enormous, but it's got to be even more enormous still. This at a time where the United States is facing growing economic difficulties, where it's in the early stages, or perhaps not such early stages, of a budgetary crisis, where US national debt already exceeds GDP, and where there are growing problems in the United States. But despite all of that, Mr. Gould wants us to continue to spend money in both theatres at the same time. This is completely unrealistic. These absurd ideas need to be abandoned. And I come back to what I'm saying. There's nothing going to stop the Russians or the Chinese from building up their military forces in the areas close to their borders. They will always retain escalatory dominance there. The United States tries to race with them around their borders, and try to race with them in a strategic arms race. It will lose. So it has to come to terms at some point. The political obstacles to doing so in the United States remain tremendous. But sooner or later, if war is to be avoided, the United States will have to come to terms. Either it does so soon, in which case, as I said, the Russians and the Chinese have shown that the price that they will exact is, in geostrategic and realist foreign policy terms, for the moment, a realist one. Or, if it comes to terms later, then, of course, the Russians and the Chinese will exact a much higher price. There is a third possibility. I've talked about the possibility of the United States agreeing a geostrategic ceasefire. The second possibility, of course, is a war. The third possibility is something else, and it's something I don't think I've talked about very much on these programs, and I'm not going to explore it today. But there is the danger, it seems to me, that overcommitment eventually leads to systems collapse. Now, that was basically what happened to the Soviet Union in the 1980s and 1990s. The Soviet Union was trying to do far too much in far too many places. It was committed to facing down the United States and Europe and maintaining a strategic arms race against the United States, and it was simultaneously locked in a Cold War with China, where it had vast numbers of troops along its border with China. And as a result, growing problems were developing in the Soviet economy, which the Soviet economic system was exacerbating. And eventually, what happened was that the Soviet Union broke under the weight of all of these commitments and contradictions. And there was a tremendous economic and social crisis and the collapse of the Soviet superpower. Well, the United States is not quite at that point, but it's starting to look increasingly as if that possibility cannot be discounted too. And what happened in the Soviet Union is that the Soviets delayed coming to terms with the Chinese and the Americans, and they also put off the day of carrying out the very urgently needed reforms within their own country and society. They delayed doing that until it was too late, because in the grip of their ideology, they found it politically impossible to do it. It seems to me that the United States is at risk of doing exactly the same thing to itself. That's all I'm going to say about that topic today. We will discuss that, no doubt, in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please look us up on the Duran, and please also remember to look up Alex's channel. You can also Please also check us out on our other platforms. The most important at the moment is Locals. We have a thriving community there. We're publishing an increasing amount of material there, exclusive material. I'm posting videos there. Alex is posting videos there, and our Duran community, which you are welcome to join, is also posting material on Locals too. We are also, of course, present on other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, Odyssey, and also the new free speech platform, SuperU. And of course, if you want to support us, you can support us by coming to our shop and buying the amazing things you will find there. Our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, our hats, our hoodies, our famous magic mugs, and all the rest. And of course, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. And also, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. There have been some rather curious things happening to some people's subscriptions, so please remember to check your subscription. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.